Now, the master of European politics, indeed global politics, but a man who knows European politics intimately, is Professor Glenn Diesen, professor at the University of Southeastern Norway and editor at Russia in Global Affairs. I'm glad to say, although he's in a great deal of demand right now, as you could imagine, Professor Glenn Diesen joins me now. Wonderful to see you again, Professor. The European counter-offer is laughable, isn't it? And if you agree, tell us in which ways.
Well, first, thank you for that very kind introduction. No, I think laughable is a good description. Delusional is one as well. And it consists of 24 points, if I'm not mistaken. And, well, a quick summary would be, of course, going back to the ceasefire, which is no need for political settlement, just freeze it where it is. NATO membership should still be on the menu. There will be no discussion of territory unless Ukraine agrees to it. There will be, of course, very powerful security guarantees, and why not have financial compensation that Russia has to pay Ukraine? So what they're asking in this peace deal is essentially Russia's capitulation, and it is quite extraordinary because Russia went to war to prevent NATO expanding into Ukraine. Then, after much suffering, Russia has now effectively won the war. Yet the Europeans thinks it's reasonable to demand that the peace agreement towards the end of the Russian victory is that, yes, NATO anchors itself in Ukraine. It doesn't really make much sense at all. And like you just said before the break, that usually it's the victorious side that gets to dictate the terms. Yet here we have the whole thing turned on its head. And I tried to make sense of it. And when you listen to the arguments of these European leaders, what they're referring to is that they are morally right. They might not have won the war, but morally they are on the right side. That is, they keep saying Russia is allegedly the aggressor, Ukraine is the victim. Therefore, it's only fair that they get to dictate the terms. You know, you can... I would put some question marks around Russia simply being an aggressor, given that all the evidence has pretty much come in, and we know that NATO triggered this war back in 2014. But even if it wasn't, this is a very strange worldview where you get to dictate the terms, even if you lose. It doesn't really make any sense at all.
Well, my football teams very, very frequently win moral victories, but the victories are never chalked up on the boards and we don't get to collect any trophies. Moral victories, even if they are moral victories, are meaningless at the end of the day. And to consider for 1 minute that NATO is the moral actor in this or any other theatre of operations is a bit of a stretch. But I want to put this to you, Professor. Do they really mean it? I mean, you say you listen to them. I'm glad that you do, so that we don't have to. But when they're putting forward this alternative plan, which is no plan for peace at all, do they mean it, or are they simply seeking to wreck Trump's plan?
No, they're seeking to wreck Trump's plan. And that's pretty much a certainty. That is, they did criticize the plan to a great extent, and of course there's always room for criticism, but it's worth noting that the Europeans haven't forwarded any serious plan of their own. Indeed, whenever they talk about peace, it's in terms of sending more weapons, escalating the sanctions, essentially to find a way of breaking Russia. This is the path to peace. This is why the Chinese were also so surprised when the Europeans came to them and tried to ask them to help them end the war. And, how? Yeah, well, we have to break Russia. This is the only solution. So they're not looking for peace. They're looking for defeating the Russians. So also, the Europeans aren't talking to the Russians. They want a seat at the table, but they can't pick up a phone. They don't call the Russians. Why can't they speak to Putin on their own? the whole idea is that they can't talk to Putin without Zelensky in the room. It's quite absurd. This is a war about the European security architecture breaking down. There's no reason why they can't speak to the Russians. And so the main objective, given that the Europeans do not want peace, is then the only pathway forward is defeating Russia. And if you want to do this, you have to pull the United States into the war, deeper into the war. They're already quite involved. But to do so, the Europeans have to sell the notion that they want peace and that it's the Russians who don't want it. So, in other words, try to direct the fury and frustration of Trump towards the Russians to pressure them into a peace deal, which is why they come up with this preposterous idea like a unconditional ceasefire. The only reason why anyone would now consider restoring Ukraine's neutrality, that is ending NATO expansion and these territorial concessions, is exactly because Russia's winning. If you end the war, why would the Europeans want to make any concessions at all? They would only escalate, intensify the military-industrial production, ship all long-range missiles they can into Ukraine, and then simply buy more time, another Minsk agreement, to prepare for continuing the war. Unconditional ceasefire has the simple aim of prolonging the war, and to do so, the main objective is to pull America into the fight.
Well, let's turn to that, Professor. I said earlier that Rubio said that he met, I think, in Geneva today with the Ukrainian and other European leaders, and that he intends to change some aspects of the plan. I make the point that any change made at the behest of Ukraine and the European leaders is a change making less likely that the Trump plan will ever come to fruition, either by Thanksgiving or by not this Christmas, but the next Christmas. So the question is, will it work for the Europeans? Will they successfully derail Trump's intentions, which may or may not be good intentions? We'll come to that next. But will they succeed, or will Trump hang tough?
Well, I think this can go either way at this point. I'm a bit skeptical to what extent the Europeans will be successful, because I think that one of the reasons why Trump is rushing this thing through is to neutralize the European leaders, because it's very open and transparent that they are looking to sabotage what he wants to do. And but on the other hand, in the United States, you have a lot of hawks as well who are not on board with this deal, who would like to also cooperate with the Europeans to derail the whole thing. Indeed, there's been some reports that many people close to Trump's team wasn't aware of this 28-point peace plan at all. So I think he has a lot of hawks at home, which he has to address as well. He has to deal with the Europeans who are determined to just keep this war going, and of course Zelensky himself, who has a lot of personal losses risking if the war comes to an end. He could be threatened. He's already been threatened if he dares to end the war along these lines. So no, I think there's many reasons why this could go wrong. But again, if they make changes in favor of what the Europeans want, and the Europeans want to derail it, how will that affect the Russians? Again, the Russians have not accepted this deal. They said, yes, this is a good, they suggested this could be a good point of departure to start negotiations. So it's not a done deal. It's a draft somewhere we can all start, which is why it's somewhat ambiguous. It's open to interpretation. But the idea that the Russians would allow hundreds of billions of their dollars to be used to rebuild Ukraine, to hand over to the Ukrainians, this isn't going to happen. But you can at least start there. You can talk. You can find some middle ground. Perhaps some of this money could then be devoted to rebuilding the destruction on the Russian sides of the front line, and in cooperation with the Americans, for example. There's some middle ground you can find, but as it stands, this deal, even the Russians aren't that happy. But it's good enough to start to talk, to sit down and have a serious format. But whatever the Europeans succeed in, it's going to get Trump further away from this goal of his.
So let's turn to the 28 points. You'll be more deeply familiar with them than me. I've, of course, read them, and some leap from the page as being non-starters. The substitution of membership of NATO to security guarantees, which are effectively Article 5 guarantees, which automatically bring war and the involvement in the war of the US and the European powers, the frozen money, which you've just referred to, hundreds of billions. You may not have heard me explain what billions mean earlier in the show. If you turn the clock back a million seconds, a million minutes, it'll take you to 2023. If you turn the clock a billion minutes, it will take you back to the Roman Empire. So begin to imagine what hundreds of billions of your money that they have frozen, that they intend to steal in the 28-point plan. Perfectly ridiculous in my view. The other points struck me again, leaping off the page, as actually quite creative. The Ukrainians would not be required to formally recognize their former territories now in Russia. That's quite creative. Other countries could and would recognize those territories, including the United States, I'm sure, but Ukraine would not be forced to do so, and so could continue notionally to imagine that one day Kupiansk would change sides of the line once again. Other creative aspects where, well, you can regard it as Russia renting these lands that they have now liberated, perhaps in perpetuity. And you could then haggle on what the rent would be, a peppercorn or $1 or $100. These are quite, I thought, quite creative potential solutions brought forward by Trump. But what's your take on the 28 points?
Well, it has a lot of flaws into it. Again, any renting, I don't see necessarily no, I don't see the Russians going along with this. But also the troop levels in Ukraine. Again, the main fear of Russia, if you want to know what they're looking for, the main fear they have is that the peace deal will simply be a temporary ceasefire before we restart hostilities. Again, there's a reason behind this. The first time we toppled the government in Ukraine was back in 2004 during the Rose Revolution. They did it again in 2014. Pretty much every deal has either been sabotaged or betrayed if it has been agreed upon. So what they really fear the most is another Minsk agreement, where we simply buy some time to rearm Ukraine. That's why, for example, freezing the Ukrainian army at 600,000 soldiers, it sounds like a lot. I'm not sure if the Russians would accept having this big threat there. And also, the whole idea of giving some security guarantees and storing a lot of long-range weapons in Poland or next to the Ukrainian borders, we can be shipped in if Russia does anything wrong. All of this is premised on the notion that NATO is somehow a neutral party, not a direct participant in this war. This is a proxy war. Even Marco Rubio, Boris Johnson, they recognize this as a proxy war. So why would the Russians accept this? It would allow NATO to essentially keep in place a Ukrainian proxy army, which they can trigger at any time if in the future, and most likely there will be some tensions, if there will be any future problems, they can then activate this massive Ukrainian proxy and pump in all these long-range missiles and then say, oh, it's the Ukrainians who are bombing Moscow, it's not us. So I think there's a lot of flaws. Otherwise, some of them were interesting. For example, Russia should be invited back into the G8. I can't remember Russia ever asking to be allowed into the G8 again. But it looks as if this is part of the thinking in Washington, though, that they would like to see bringing the whole point of a peace would be to bring Russia to our side of the ledger. That is, instead of pushing it too far towards China, it should be allowed to integrate more towards the West. And I know there's been a lot of mockery around this, but I actually think it's a good idea to which allows Russia to diversify its foreign partners. You know, it can have a foot in bricks and still sit at around the table with the Western countries. But again, a lot of this, if this is the objective, then yes, fine and well, but it's not something that's going to entice the Russians to give up anything, because they couldn't care less, I think, about the G8.
Yeah, it doesn't butter all that many parsnips being invited to the G8 when you look at the G8 and their really rather parlous economic performance and prospects. But the potential 600,000 strong army, which is 8 times larger than the entire British armed forces, we're being told by, not just by the European leaders, by the way, but by the well-known British nationalist leader, Nigel Farage, is up in arms at this outrageous demand that Ukraine should only have an army 8 times bigger than the entire British armed forces. This is going to be crucial, isn't it? Because, as you say, and we both have been in Russia comparatively recently, the Russians' biggest fear is that they have to do all this all over again. And if you're going to obviate or negate that fear, well, you've got to have a Ukrainian armed force that is simply too small and armed too poorly to be able to force Russia to do all this again.
No, exactly. And again, the whole thing goes back to the question, what caused this war? Because the whole logic of the Europeans, including then Farage, would be that Ukraine needs a powerful army to deter Russia from invading again. But again, there's a security competition at play here. It's worth noting that before 2014, no one in Moscow was talking about using military force against Ukraine. There was no territorial claims against Ukraine. This started in February of 2022, when NATO toppled the government in Ukraine to pull it into the NATO orbit. We already know this from the New York Times, that the day after the coup, the US and British installed a new intelligence chief in Ukraine, and the CIA and MI6 started up cooperating on the first day, before the Russians had taken Crimea or responded in any way. And the purpose of this was to use Ukraine as a tool, as a proxy against Russia. This is even confirmed by other papers, like the Washington Post, that the Americans had to rebuild the intelligence services from scratch in Ukraine because the previous ones used to be quite sympathetic and favorable to Russia. They were indeed, Russia were the main partner, and they had to convert Ukraine into an enemy. So this is the idea that Russia is hell-bent on invading and absorbing Ukraine. This is a fallacy. This was a reaction to a NATO offensive. That is, NATO triggered this in 2014. This is just the reality of it. So the whole problem with this argument that Ukraine should have this massive, powerful army is this is essentially going to be another instrument of NATO to go after Ukraine. So no, I think, of course, after going through such a painful war, I can understand why it seems very unfair to Ukraine that they won't have a big army to deter. But this is again going to be a humiliating piece, because it was very reckless war, unnecessary war. So I admit that it's going to be very humiliating, but this is the best, I think, the best option. There are no other options on the table. Indeed, the whole point is, when you lose the war, you don't get to dictate the terms, and they have lost the war. Indeed, even the biggest warmongers in Europe, now gung-ho on war, have premised the idea of a victory based on the US selling weapons it doesn't have to the Europeans, who don't have the money to pay for it, so they can send it to Ukraine, which doesn't have the manpower to use them. It's just a horrible plan all over, and it's a military collapse, it's an economic failure, there's a lack of international support. Everything that can go wrong is going wrong now. So this is not the time to set up this ridiculous delusional demands.
Now, I know as a distinguished academic, you don't like to take a guess or even to speculate necessarily. But if I tell you my speculation is that this is not going to work and that the war will continue, will you show me your speculation?
Yeah, well, I assume, it's hard to look into my crystal ball and make a clear prediction because I guess there's too many unknown variables which can play in here. But I assume that Zelensky and he will sign up for it on principle, something to discuss, just to delay Trump's pressure tactics. Because if he just rejects it outright, he might risk the U.S. pulling support, everything from logistics to more weapons and intelligence, which they require to continue fighting the Russians. So he will have to give the image of wanting to go along with this, but then he will look for a way of making it seem as if the Russians aren't playing ball. I don't think it's going to work well, but it's going to be a delaying tactic, and during this time, I think Trump will start to lose patience, but also the Russians will continue to make great advancements. And I think I don't see a political settlement yet. I think things has to get much worse on the battlefield before we can get a political deal. Because what the Russians are asking for, though, is a big ask. This is a very humiliating defeat for the Ukrainians. So. But again, they have lost, and but if they lose further, I think this is what's going to build up the pressure which is required to give in. But if you saw the latest speech by Zelensky, where he said that this was the major dilemma: either they hold on to their dignity by rejecting this, or they go along with it. Or if they reject the deal, then of course they're going to lose the American support. So it's a very difficult spot they're in. So I think it's going to try to find a middle way. But ultimately, I think the war will continue to go on, and the Russians will continue to increase the very rapid advancements they're now making. And at some point, something will break, and then a much worse deal will come on the table, which Zelensky will have to sign.
And General Winter
just as a
has
final
just
comment,
arrived
this is why
on the battlefield.
Well, it's the people who, I think it's no doubt anymore that the people who have the worst enemies of Ukraine have really been the people who has been portraying themselves as the friends of Ukraine, who has been for the past 11 years now rejecting any peace, always escalated and ignored all of the suffering which is happening there on the front. I think, it's, as I said, every day the deal will get much, much worse. And it's, I don't know, from my perspective, this again, on this I agree with Trump. This war never had to happen. It was a massive mistake, and the Europeans will eventually pay a lot for it as well.